Miss Borowski is employed as a secretary receptionist at the Remax Real Estate Company, which is located only about 3 blocks from her apartment. Lorraine was to have opened the office on Saturday morning, but her keys, some cosmetics, and a pair of her shoes were found strewn in front of the firm. Friends and associates of the missing woman have been unable to shed any light on the mystery, but police believe that Miss Borowski has met with foul play.
Hey everyone, this is the house of Chicago Ripper crew ringleader Robin Gecht, and supposedly in the attic they did some satanic rituals and actually ate breasts that they would cut off of women. So I just thought I'd share this.
On Halloween night, Robin Gecht, his wife, and their 3 children moved out of the house they had rented for just over a year at 2163 McVicker Avenue. The landlord said they were 3 months behind in the rent. A child's tricycle is all that the family left behind. That and the impression they made on their neighbors.
The small dealings that we had with them, they were like a normal family as far as we knew. They had kids. The kids are always playing. He did the work in the yard, cut the grass, trim the trees, and more or less he started working on the house and painting like anybody else in this neighborhood.
Neighbors described Gecht and his wife as quiet people who kept to themselves. But there was one incident the people here are still talking about. It happened last summer when, according to neighbors, Gecht came out of his house with a shotgun and broke up a fight back here in the alley. Then he was regarded as a neighborhood hero. Now, people in this close-knit neighborhood are shocked to learn of his arrest. Gecht, who worked on and off as an electrician, also shared his home with 2 of his helpers, Edward Spreitzer and Andrew Corcoralis. The news that the 3 men are suspected in up to 17 murders has sent a wave of fear through the homes where Gecht was invited to do odd jobs.
Hey everyone, so I'm at the former Moonlit Motel. It's now called the Brer Rabbit Hotel, and this is a significant place if you're interested in true crime, because this happens to be the place where the body of Linda Sullivan was found in a field. And I don't know if it was we're there somewhere or what. I mean, it's kind of changed around here a little bit. But basically what happened was the Chicago Ripper crew dumped her body here. And it was in the process of being decomposed, so it had been there for a while. And people started complaining about the smell. And she was covered in maggots and, you know. Anyway, it was pretty gruesome. It definitely encouraged people to look at this place. So, anyway, this was called the Moonlit Motel back in the 80s. So, mouse for a rabbit.
Get rid of it. There he found the source of the smell, which was not, as he expected, a dead animal. It was a young woman whose remains consisted largely of bones and some clinging flesh. He turned around immediately and called the police. 3 detectives arrived, and they could see that this victim had been there a while. Quite a while. In fact, she was so decomposed that they could see her skeletal structure, but the maggots were still there, doing their work, an unusual combination of post-mortem characteristics. The woman clearly had been murdered, because she had been bound with handcuffs before being left there, probably before she had died. She also had cloth in her mouth, used as a gag, and still wore a sweater and panties, but they had been pulled down to her thighs. In her socks was a small wad of dollar bills, so robbery had not been the motive. The key issue at the moment was to first establish the corpse's identity, and then figure out the time interval from the moment of her discovery to the moment she had died. In the condition this body was in, that would be difficult. In those days, there was no body farm, an institution set up in Knoxville, Tennessee, to help establish time of death for remains like this. In fact, information they had at that point about such estimations was mostly anecdotal. Only an expert could offer an answer. Investigators also needed to establish whether this was the primary crime scene where she had been killed, or rather a secondary scene where she had been dumped after she was dead. The fact that no one had yet reported the body indicated that it might not have been there that long. However, that possibility implied that whoever had killed her was able to tolerate decomposing remains long enough to carry them and place them here. One thing the detectives knew they could check was the oil beneath her body to determine whether bodily fluids had leaked into it. But there was no use trying to analyze the situation at the moment. They had to deliver the body to the deputy coroner, Pete Siekman, so that he could attempt to determine the cause and manner of death, as well as take fingerprints and teeth impressions to compare to records, if they existed. They then could stake out the scene and start searching for evidence. A search of missing persons reports turned up no leads, so detectives called the Chicago department, who told them that the practice of rolling money inside socks probably indicated that the victim had been a hooker. That made the process of identifying her much more difficult. But the fingerprints and dental records helped, and in less than 2 weeks, they had an ID. Linda Sutton, age 21. As they had suspected, she proved to be a prostitute with a string of arrests. She was also the mother of 2 children, both of whom lived with Sutton's mother. But a twist in the case came from the coroner. Despite the advanced state of decomposition of the body, he had determined that she had been dead for only 3 days. The remains' advanced rate of decomposition was due to 2 rather large wounds to her chest where her breasts had been removed, which had allowed for an invasion of parasites that had devoured the body in record time. This woman had been brutally assaulted and mutilated, and she was not the last one to be found. A few days later, the body of a Hispanic woman wearing an engagement ring was discovered. She had also been raped and strangled. While her breasts were not removed, they had been badly bitten. Her killer had also masturbated over her body. A psychiatric assessment of the crime pegged the attacker as a local man who probably loved animals and had a family. He also had a dark side that no one knew, turning into a cruel psychopathic murderer at night. In May, another young woman, Lorraine, was abducted from where she worked as she crossed the parking lot alone. She was repeatedly raped and then subjected to having a wire wrapped around her breast to sever it from her body. Finally, one of her attackers killed her with a hatchet. The woman's remains were recovered at a dump site, which was in the same general area where Sutton had been dumped, although this time it was a cemetery known as Clarendon Hills. The unknown attacker did not wait as long for the next assault. 2 weeks after Borowski had been abducted and killed, Shui Mack was abducted on May 29th as she was returning home from her family's restaurant in Streamwood. She had been riding in her brother's car, but after they argued, he dropped her off to wait for a ride with other relatives whom he believed were following behind. They never saw her again because she was abducted. Her body was discovered 4 months later at the end of August, buried at a construction site, and 2 had been similarly mutilated. In August, Sandra Delaware was found dumped alongside of the Chicago River. Her wrists were bound together behind her with a shoelace, and her left breast had been removed in the same fashion as the prior victims.
Okay. So, the body of Sandra Delaware was found under this bridge here. And that is the Chicago River. She was thrown from the bridge, and her body was found somewhere around here.
A bra was knotted around her throat. She was just a kid, but as a prostitute she had been vulnerable. They estimated her death at approximately 6 hours earlier. In less than 2 weeks, Carol Pappas, aged 42, turned up missing, as did Rose Beck Davis, 30, a marketing executive. She was found stabbed, raped, and strangled on September 8, 1982, behind a stairwell of a North Lakeshore apartment building. A black sock was tied around her neck, and her clothing was in disarray. Her face was crushed, and blood pooled beneath her. It turned out later that she had been beaten with a hatchet. Her abductors had left her for dead, but she survived and was taken to the hospital. She was able to give the police a description of the gang of men who were grabbing women off the streets and subjecting them to an extreme form of sadistic sexual abuse. Beverly Washington managed to provide the officers with several significant characteristics about the man who had attacked her. The driver had been a slender white man who looked to be around 25, wearing a flannel shirt and square-toed boots. He had greasy brown hair and a mustache. Washington said he had offered more money than she'd asked for and had seemed unaccountably nervous. When he asked her to get into the back of the van with him, he had a gun. He ordered her to remove her clothes, and she quickly obeyed. Then he placed handcuffs on her, forced her to perform oral sex, and threatened her with violence if she did not swallow the handful of pills he had handed her. As she passed out, she saw him holding a cord over her, and she feared that she was going to die. The man dumped her into the trash, one breast severed and the other nearly so, but someone discovered her and called the police. Rushed to the hospital, she was saved. Police officers who questioned her asked her about the van he was driving, and she said that it had been red with tinted windows and a wooden divider inside. She also told them that there were feathers and a roach clip hanging from the rearview mirror. Those details proved to be helpful in making an arrest. Within 3 weeks, on October 20th, 1982, the police pulled over a red van and questioned the driver. He had red hair and did not resemble the victim's description, but the van fit perfectly. The driver told them his name was Eddie Spreitzer, and that the van belonged to his boss, Robin Gecht. The officers directed Spreitzer to Gecht's house and had him beckon Gecht outside. They hoped that he would be their guy, and when he came out, he did indeed fit the description, down to his shirt and boots. Yet he acted as if he had no worries at all and was quite willing to help. Either he was innocent of these crimes, or utterly arrogant, confident that he was untouchable. Later, the victim picked Gecht out of a set of photos as the man who had assaulted her. But when detectives went back to see him, Gecht had a lawyer. It was clear that he was going to be quite careful in his dealings with the police, and in fact, they found him difficult to shake up. According to some sources, he had an interesting association with the notorious criminal from the area, arrested 3 years earlier in 1979. Chicago, it seemed, had attracted its share of unusual offenders. Spreitzer first admitted to driving the van, as Gecht committed a drive-by shooting in which a man died and another was left paralyzed. Investigators quickly identified the incident. Then Gecht directed him to slow down to pick up a black prostitute. Gecht had sex with her and then took her into an alley and used a knife to remove her left breast. Placed it into the van on the floor. Spritzer was quite upset as he spilled out all these gory details, claiming he did not like all of the blood. He added that during such incidents, Gecht sometimes had sex with the breast on the spot. He also described how Gecht had shot a black woman in the head, chained her up, and used bowling balls to weigh her down in the water. He never believed that she had never been found. According to what he told Jennifer Furio in the serial killer letters years later in prison, he had watched Gecht batter a woman with a hammer. The sight made him vomit. But on another woman, he removed the breast himself, cutting off both. He thought she was dead when he did this, but did not try to find out for certain. He said that Gecht had forced him to have sexual contact with the woman's gaping wounds. By the time Spritzer was finished, he had offered details of 7 outright murders and 1 aggravated battery. His interrogators were shaken by the abhorrent nature of the acts, yet they believed they now had some leverage with Gecht, who was in another interrogation room. They collected photographs of known victims and laid them before Gecht. He looked at them without much interest and denied knowing any of the women featured in them. The detectives then took him to an area where he could plainly see Spritzer showing something to other officers. But he still did not waver. He acted as if he had nothing to hide, because Spritzer had clearly implicated him. The detectives found his behavior frustrating. But Gecht's nearness had an odd effect on Spritzer. He suddenly changed his story, as if afraid, and said that Gecht had not murdered anyone. His account became so chaotic that his interrogators did not know what to believe. Spritzer now said that another man, his girlfriend's brother, Andrew Kokorelis, had been the killer, but he could not offer many details about the man. Gecht confirmed that he knew Kokorelis had been the killer, but he could not offer many details about the man. Gecht confirmed that he knew Kokorelis and even provided police with an address, but once again, his demeanor was undisturbed. He seemed not to know things about Kokorelis that Spritzer did. Dismayed, the police went to question this third member of the killing crew. They wondered if 3 men could really kill together in such a horrendous manner. They did not yet know the half of it. It wasn't long before Kokorelis also confessed. Kokorelis talked about how they had kidnapped women off the streets, raped them, and stabbed them with knives, razors, tin can lids, and can openers. With piano wire, they then amputated one or both breasts and masturbated onto them. He admitted to the murders of Rose Beck Davis and Lorraine Borowski, and inadvertently confessed that he had been involved in the deaths of 18 women. As he described the assault on Sandra Delaware, he said that he had shoved a rock into her mouth to keep her from screaming, forcing a wine bottle into her that made her bleed badly, and stabbed her with a knife. Her autopsy report confirmed these details. Along with the interrogations, detectives were also asking acquaintances of the suspects about their characters and personal habits. It soon became clear that Gecht had a breast fetish, asking girls he knew to let him stab them with pins. He allegedly forced his wife to endure much more, including infected wounds, although she never turned him in. But when the detectives began questioning Kokorelis' slow-witted brother, Tommy, they were in for another rude surprise. His odd behavior indicated that he, too, had been on this Ripper crew. Shortly, he broke down and confessed, adding even more gruesome details. Ostensibly, these young men had joined in a fad that was sweeping the country during the 1980s, especially among teenagers, of satanic worship. Yet the Rippers had taken their rituals much farther than most who believed they could somehow contact the Dark One. Gecht's associates took the flesh they had removed from their victims, according to Tommy's confession, cut it up, and consumed it as a form of ancient devilish communion. Gecht allegedly had an altar in the attic of his Northwest Side home, where they gathered during the evening hours after his wife had gone to work. Supposedly, he had painted 6 red and black crosses on the walls and covered the altar with a red cloth. Tommy told the police that they would all kneel together around the altar and Gecht would produce the freshly removed breasts. He would read passages from the Bible as each man masturbated into the fleshy portion of the body part. When everyone was finished, Gecht would cut it up and hand around pieces for them to eat. After the interrogations, the teen killers were held in Pontiac Correctional Center on $1 million bond on a variety of charges. Gecht adamantly refused to admit to the charges, although he had worked as a construction subcontractor for John Wayne Gacy during the 1970s, and it had supposedly been said that Gacy's single mistake was not killing 33 young men, but keeping most of the bodies under his house. In other words, Gecht showed no awareness of the wrongness of Gacy's brutality. He just thought the man had gone about it the wrong way. As the police interviewed more people, they learned that the Spreitzer and the Cocorales brothers were not alone in their fear of Gecht or their belief in his powers. Others claimed that he had a real ability to draw people to him and get them to do his bidding. One person warned detectives to never look into Gecht's eyes. No matter how sick or disgusting an act might be, he could inspire others to get involved. He got his start by molesting his sister, according to some accounts, and was then sent to live with his grandparents. During adolescence, he developed his keen interest in Satanism and its secret rituals. The newspapers grabbed the story using headlines that linked the Ripper crew or the Chicago Rippers with the notorious Jack the Ripper. Each member of this deadly crew faced his own separate trial. Gecht attempted to avoid trial by offering an insanity excuse. He was evaluated for competency and found to be competent to stand trial, as well as being considered to have been sane at the time of the offenses. He did have a mistrial, so his second trial began on September 30th, 1983. The prosecutor had some rather compelling evidence. In the search, the police had found the chapel, as well as a rifle used in a shooting. They also found satanic literature and a trophy box owned by Gecht, in which Andrew had described seeing as many as 15 pieces of female breasts. From victim reports, the MO was detailed for the jury. Women had been kidnapped, held against their will, and tortured with implements such as needles and ice picks. They were also gang raped and then forced to endure having their breasts sliced off with a garroting wire so the men could use them for a satanic sacrifice. Often the victims died, but they had likely felt the horrendous pain of this mutilation before they finally expired. Yet 2 had survived it and now lived with the memories of their ordeals. Gecht took the stand to speak in his own defense. He admitted that he had attacked Beverly Washington, but in court he insisted that he had killed no one and was innocent of rape and aggravated battery. He protested that during the time when most of the murders had occurred, he was not even acquainted with the other defendants. Despite compelling eyewitness testimony, as well as testimony from women who claimed that Gecht had asked them to cut off their nipples for him, the confessions of the others implicated Gecht were not admissible against him. With no physical evidence linking him to murder, he could not be prosecuted for any of the killings, and his accomplices were not willing to testify against him. Nevertheless, the jury found Gecht guilty on all counts with which he was charged: attempted murder, rape, deviant sexual assault, aggravated battery, and armed violence. He was sentenced to 120 years in prison. Tommy Cocorales, age 23, attempted to block his confession from being admitted into his trial, but lost. He was convicted in 1984 and was sentenced to 70 years in prison for his part in Lorraine Borowski's murder. Andrew Cocorales was tried in 2 separate counties. The first trial was for the murder of Rose Beck Davis. In his confession, he had admitted that he had abducted Davis with the other men, forced her into the van, and had beaten her with a hatchet until she was dead. The jury deliberated just over 3 hours before finding him guilty of rape and murder. They sentenced him to life in prison. At his second trial, Cocorales decided to recant everything he had confessed 4 different times, and to deny that he had killed or raped anyone. He claimed that the police had coerced each of his confessions, had made false promises, and had even beaten him into admitting what they wanted him to say. Prosecutor Brian Thielander went through the interrogations performed by 6 separate detectives and 2 prosecutors, but Cocorales insisted they had told him exactly what to say. He also indicated that one police officer had told him the details of the crime scene, giving him all that he needed to confess. Yet when Detective Warren Wilcoch took the stand to describe his interrogation, he said that when he had shown Kokorellis a line of photos, Kokorellis had picked out Lorraine Borowski and said, "That's the girl Eddie Spreitzer and I killed in the cemetery." It came down to a matter of who was more believable. Kokorellis was sullen and angry. In his story that 8 different officials had all treated him in the same unethical manner seemed far-fetched, to say the least. The jury deliberated only 3 hours before returning their verdict. They found Kokorellis guilty of the murder of Lorraine Borowski and sentenced him to death. At his sentencing hearing, he once again denied the charges, and his attorneys argued later that despite the verdict, the act did not merit the death penalty. In addition, Kokorellis argued that he had received ineffectual counsel at sentencing, and that in the case of the murder of Rose Beck Davis from the earlier trial, that offense had not warranted the death penalty but life in prison. He insisted that the court had not proven his intent to kill, or any degree of premeditation. Nevertheless, the court saw otherwise as the panel of judges dismissed the appeals and upheld the sentence in 1989. So his attorneys tried a different tactic. They argued that Kokorellis was a killer suffering from schizophrenia, so that he had not known what he was doing when he committed the murder. They claimed the trial lawyers should have entered an insanity defense, but had not. They had not even had him psychiatrically evaluated, which was a significant oversight on their part. The appeals attorneys also argued that when those attorneys had failed to see the need for an evaluation, the trial judge should have ordered one for the court. He had not, however. In fact, a prison psychiatrist had diagnosed Kokorellis with borderline personality disorder and found him incompetent to stand trial. However, psychiatric diagnosis would not make him incompetent or insane, so it was a weak argument at best. They argued that Kokorellis had been vulnerable to a strong influence and was therefore not entirely responsible for what he had done. When the district judge queried the trial attorneys about these issues, they claimed no pattern of abhorrent behavior had made anyone who knew the defendant suspect a psychiatric disorder. That satisfied the judge that the pending affidavit was unpersuasive. Yet the appeals attorneys pointed to Kokorellis' bizarre behavior as proof of his aberrant condition. The court considered this and decided that abnormal behavior does not imply the type of mental impairment required for a finding of insanity. In a 41-page opinion, the court said that it found no reversible error and affirmed the sentence again. But that was not the end of the story, for a movement was afoot to overturn all death sentences in the state. Kokorellis' case, which seemed obvious to deserve the death penalty. The Illinois State Supreme Court reversed Harrison's stay by a vote of 4-3. And hours before Kokorellis was to exit the world, Governor Ryan issued a 3-page statement to the effect that a jury had decided his fate according to the law of the land. His attempts to appeal it had been rejected over a span of 16 years. So Ryan was not about to stand in the way. Thus, there were no further barriers between this member of the Ripper crew and his death. On the morning before his execution, Kokorellis was convinced that it was not going to happen. He was flown to a super maximum security prison in Tams, Illinois, and he spent the rest of the day praying and fasting. He then spoke to a few select friends on the phone, bidding them farewell. With his brother, not Tommy, he prayed and cried. Yet Kokorellis still believed that there would be a last-minute pardon. Strapped onto the gurney, he offered the Borowski family an apology, said that the kingdom of heaven was at hand, and then received a lethal injection at 12:34 p.m.
Also breaking this morning, a member of the infamous Ripper crew released from prison after nearly 40 years. The crimes so brutal, investigators compared them to Jack the Ripper and Charles Manson.
Thomas Kokorellis left the Illinois River Correctional Center in downstate Canton at dawn. Tom Negevin is there live with the details. Tom?
You know, this is such a remarkable story, you guys. Kokorellis, likely the only member of the infamous Ripper crew who will ever see the outside world again. His release extremely difficult to take, as you might imagine, for the families of 18 murdered Chicago area women. He originally got life for his role in the murder of a 21-year-old Elmhurst woman in May of 1982, but a rape conviction overturned on appeal and now defunct sentencing rules set him free after serving just half his time.
I thought he was going to be in prison till I died.
For 83-year-old Lorraine Borowski, this brings it all flooding back. The terror and the loss of her daughter Lori, the 4 killers committing sick satanic rituals, rape, and murder, prowling Chicago and the suburbs for vulnerable women.
They thought they were all insane, and I said, how could 4 guys be insane at the same time? And they hung around together. That don't mean they're insane. They're just evil. Evil.
Documenting that evil, this 17-page 1982 confession in which Cocorellis describes the cult and how its members preyed on women in graphic detail. Still too much for Lori's brothers to bear.
It's disturbing because it's not just us. There is other families.
He took something from me that was very close to me. I live it every day of my life. I'll never forget it. It's just like yesterday to me.
Now, we're being told Thomas Cocorellis will have to register as a sex offender, but other than that faces no restrictions. He actually completed his parole inside. Outside this morning, opposition continues to build to his release. In fact, this afternoon, famed attorney Gloria Allred and other family members plan to hold a press conference in Rosemont to express their dismay with this situation, his release, and the state of the justice system. In Canton, Tom Negevin, WGN News.